Okay, let's go ahead and get started, David.
Okay, should I go with the front matter here?
Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to this CoSA member webinar. Your hosts are Lisa Johnson, who knows how this thing works, and me, the talented amateur first timer. I'm David Ware from the Arkansas State Archives. And we have a fascinating program for today, getting to know Enslaved.org. Now, Enslaved.org is a discovery platform that interconnects people involved in the historical slave trade so that we can see the lives of enslaved persons, families, and communities in richer detail. It's built from disparate data sets, contributed by scholars, librarians, archivists, and genealogists, and a great aggregator of data this is. Daryle Williams and Catherine Foley will provide an overview of Enslaved.org, Peoples of the Historical Slave Trade. They'll describe the data model that drives the Enslaved.org Discovery Hub. They'll identify resources that can guide the development of historical slavery data sets, and they'll explain how contributors submit new data sets to Enslaved.org through the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, which I have sampled and I have already started to learn and go, wow, from. So at any rate, Lisa, shall I read out the bios and let the presentations begin?
Yes, go ahead. And Catherine, go ahead and go to the next slide. There we go.
Okay, our speakers today. Catherine Foley is Director of Digital Library and Archive Projects at Matrix, the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at Michigan State University. She holds a Master of Library Science degree with expertise in metadata standards and digital repositories. She has experience working with semantic technologies and ontology development for the publication of linked open data. Since 2005, Foley has managed numerous digital repository projects with African cultural heritage resources, including the Archive of Malian Photography, the Community Video Education Trust Digital Archive, and African Oral Narratives, Life Histories, Interviews, Folklore, and Song from Sub-Saharan Africa. She is currently co-managing Enslaved Peoples of the Historical Slave Trade, a Mellon Foundation-funded linked open data project with multiple international partners. Foley served as the principal investigator and project manager on two NEH collaborative research projects, Pluralism and Adaptation in the Islamic Practice of Senegal and Ghana, collaborative research and scholarship on West Africa, and Islam and Modernity, Alternatives in Contemporary Senegambia and Ghana. She has presented papers at professional conferences and at US universities, and her publications have appeared in the Journal of Web Semantics and Islamic Africa. Foley she lived, researched, and coached in South Africa for 2 years, once in 1997-98, and then again in 2010. Our other presenter today is Dr. Daryle Williams, serves as the University of California, Riverside's Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Prior to coming to Riverside in September of 2021, Williams spent most of his academic career at the University of Maryland and internationally. Williams' teaching and scholarship focus on modern Latin America, especially 19th and 20th century Brazilian history. His work to build Enslaved.org, an online database documenting the experiences of enslaved people, has won widespread national media attention since its launch in December of 2020. Williams earned his undergraduate history degree and certificate in Latin American studies from Princeton University and master's and PhD in history from Stanford University. Williams and his husband, Stephen, live in historic downtown Riverside. Welcome to you both, and I'm going to be quiet and start learning something.
Thank you, David. Catherine, I'm going to start. Is that right? So what an honor and pleasure to join you. And I recognize we have been doing the Zoom thing for many years now, maybe too long. And I think this is actually one of those wonderful opportunities that we can gather together across dispersed geographies to talk about an important project that's been very meaningful for the study of enslaved slavery and especially the lives of the enslaved, but also been pretty meaningful for our connections that we have to various archives, libraries, university, and community organizations interested in that. So today we'll talk Catherine and I will talk some about the Enslaved.org project and describe a little bit of our data model that we use for our online open source, open access digital discovery platform. Known as Enslaved.org. And any of you who are interested in this, of course, can go to our website, which is Enslaved.org, and navigate along with the presentation as well. And then also we'll talk about some of the resources that we can, that are used to guide the development of a historical slavery data set, both the resources that are available for researchers in archives, libraries, and other places, but also the resources that we've gathered together on our site. And then talk some about the journal, as David mentioned, which is our principal entry point for new contributions to the Enslaved.org platform. So we've already touched on this just a bit. Our website went live on December 1st, 2020. And if you can imagine back then, that was a deep pandemic. It was pre-vaccinations. And it was a very difficult time, but it was also a very generative time for those of us who've been working at the intersections of data sciences and digital humanities and slavery studies. And it was also a very of the moment time as well. If you think about 2020 being a moment of social and racial justice protests, both in the street and also online here. So we launched on December 1st, 2020, but the project itself originated a couple of years prior to that when we did receive funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and that was built upon some work that had been started earlier in the decade around trying to find some places and some personnels and some interest in both archiving data sets associated with slavery and the lives of the enslaved, but also linking together the various projects that had been in development across various spaces and times in the United States and internationally. Again, around studies of enslavement here. So here's our landing page, and then some of our sponsors. We have some additional partners and sponsors as well, but the Mellon Foundation has been our primary funder for the past 4 years. But we've also now been working more closely with some support from the National Endowment for the Humanities with various state archives, heritage organizations, universities as well. Our principal university sponsors are Michigan State, where Enslaved.org is based, University of Maryland, my prior institution, my current institution as well, University of California, Riverside. We'll have to get our logo in there. And then Matrix, which is a digital humanities center at MSU. Here's some photos of some members of the team. We've had some additions and a couple of people who recently moved on, but it gives you a sense of the scope of our team, which includes historians and data science people, trained in data sciences and information, library and information studies, some folks as well who are in the broader humanities, and then some folks on the technical side as well. So it'll give you some sense of the people behind the site. So if we move on here, our founding partners here, and this is where I touched upon the work that we brought together in 2020 is really based upon work that had been in development, sometimes even dating back to the 1960s, but certainly by the 1970s, and what now is known as slave voyages, but which originally known as the Transatlantic slave database, where people, particularly historians, some social scientists, were using machine-readable data sets, computers and computing to understand, recover, analyze, narrate, explore enslavement, principally using large serial data sets or creating large serial data sets here. So slave voyages became both a precursor, but also one of our founding partners. And I say founding partners with some of the data sets and the personnel associated with those projects. But also this included Slave Society, what is now called Slave Society's Digital Archives, which is based at Vanderbilt University, which is a project that looks at principally ecclesiastical, sometimes civil documentation as well. Legacies of British Slave Ownership, which is based in London, University College London, which uses as its kind of core data set a series of claims made by former slaveholders in the British Empire. Hudgens Center for African and African American Research. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work that Skip Gates, among others, have done at telling stories, and particularly using the narrative or the biographical approach. And so we have contributions there and some others, as you can see from the logos here. So these founding partners kind of came together, both the personnel and the data, to figure out what kind of linked open data platform could we develop. That moved on then to some of our newer partners, and these have joined over the course of the last couple of years. Some of these include archives, including the State Archive of Maryland State Archives and Legacies of Slavery in Maryland, the Library of Virginia, and then some you might recognize from general family histories, genealogical services, like such as Family Search, other research institutions, Alejandro, and historic and heritage organizations like Oatlands, which is a historic house associated with the Monroe family in Fairfax County, or no, I'm sorry, Loudoun County, Virginia, among others. So these partners are both traditional and our new partners have played various roles. Some is to imagine what, I had a note here, just want to make sure. Oh, right, this is a note to everyone in the audience, just to make sure, the chat, perfect. I want to make sure this wasn't for me. To imagine what a linked open data that really is built upon open source and open access a platform would look like. And then how to bring together the various kinds of questions and concerns and approaches and materials that have been developed and continue to be developed around the lives of the enslaved to bring them together. So we both use the kind of the collective knowledge of these various projects and the people associated with them, but also the content to develop what we now call Enslaved.org. So our next one is really to talk about why we do this. Well, of course, when you think about slavery, especially in slavery and enslavement, particularly of Africans, as one of the most significant features of modern human history. And it's been studied and understood and experienced across many different spaces and times here. But one of the things that developed over the course of the academic study, and in some ways also the way in which sort of popular memories, is to displace the human or the individual to understand slavery. Either there's this dehumanizing and depersonalizing event, or a knowledge that cannot be turned to the individual experiences. So we are very interested in thinking about individuals in enslavement, both enslaved and enslavers, and also the humanity of the entire process, including the wonderful things that come out of aspirations for freedom and struggles for autonomy, but also the horrible things that humans do to others. So we really center the human here, and we really center the individual. We try to look at the named individual, and both in our data model, but also in the way in which we organize the project here. And so we oftentimes are looking at individuals who have been written out of history or erased or effaced from history, but also to understand how their individuality is actually can be possibly recoverable, particularly using some digital tools. But also this is part of their past, and in many ways our own shared past. And our shared past includes our nation, and but also for our communities and families as well. So we do have this preservation piece as well. Data sets, as we all know, have a tendency to become outdated in their technologies and even erode or disappear because of data disintegration. And so we're trying to use our work of preservation, just as archivists and libraries do, for digital materials. And we have adopted a new approach to the publication in the humanities, which is the publication not just of an online journal, online peer-reviewed journal, which is not necessarily all that new, but we publish data sets, which is a fairly new phenomena within the humanities. And we peer review, we have a peer review process for these data sets, which are then made available through our platform, but also archived at Dataverse. And I think Catherine will talk about that in a bit. So next slide, please. So what we do, and as you can see here, extract data. There's a couple different things. And I say the we, I want to say this is probably more focused on the researchers than us at the project itself, but we make the work of the researchers legible and visible. But when we call upon and accept material that has extracted data from various primary source materials. Primary source materials can be a whole range of things. Some things we traditionally would associate with the world of enslavement: sales and ledgers, baptismal records, muster rolls, account books, and also narratives and various kinds of prose and other kinds of materials. But these primary source materials have a rich set of material about the lives of the enslaved, often named. And so we encourage or make possible work that extracts not just names, but also attributes, features of that named individual's lives, both for the enslaved and for the enslaved, but also for the enslavers and others who have participated in historical slavery, including the slave trade. And then this extraction process translates into spreadsheets. And I think one of the things that people get a little bit surprised is, fundamentally what we do at enslaved.org is we work in and with spreadsheets. Spreadsheets, we know, could be definitely soul deadeningly tedious, and sometimes the work is in that way, but these spreadsheets become the foundation for a whole range of different kinds of possibilities to do research. And we publish those spreadsheets, which we call datasets, along with some material called data articles, which is prose describing the spreadsheets, as well as data dictionaries or just metadata, particularly in our discovery platform. We, of course, at the center, we provide some guidance on best practices, and the peer review process also looks at quality. And then we work with our contributors, both with the work that they do and also what we expect to describe and contextualize through something called a data article, but also through our data model. And we have, of course, I've already discussed here a little bit, we archive or preserve and align through our data model data, which can be disparate, taken from different places, different times, using different terms, and align that to our model, which then provides a greater power of discovery across various research projects, integrating those as well. So I just want to give you an example of how this worked in very recent past. We have a commitment to provide training and research opportunities at all levels, including at the undergraduate level. So this past summer, I co-led a summer research opportunity program, which was sponsored by our Enslaved.org project, New York Life Foundation, among others. 7 students were given one document, that document on the left, which you can see the title there: List of slaves belonging to the state of Thomas Crampton, deceased, that are hired out. It's an undated document, which is archived at Riversdale Historic House Museum, which is in Riverdale, Maryland. They were given one document, and they spent 7 weeks on this one document. And you're like, oh my goodness. But it took quite some time. This document, as we know, it was probably written somewhere between 1831 and 1838. It's associated with a major slaveholder in the state of Maryland, Thomas Crampton, who died. And as his estate was being divvied up among heirs who were fighting each other, some of the enslaved individuals and his estate were rented out to other slaveholders in Maryland and the District of Columbia. So the students were given this one document. They had some challenges: paleography, how to read 19th century handwriting, how to deal with the word deceased, even the title is abbreviated. And they thought for about a week and a half that the word said deed, but they eventually figured out it was deceased. But they did an extraction, first a transcription process, just transcribed what they saw, each as individuals, and then did a more structured extraction process by extracting it, then taking the information and putting it into columns and rows in a spreadsheet. I'm showing the whole spreadsheet here, but you can see in the end the fields that they chose. This is from their data dictionary here. Then they defined what they understood to be in that field, and then described whether that field was a direct transcription, something that appeared in the original document, or whether it was an imputed attribute. So this data dictionary gives you some sense of the data extraction process. From the document on your left, the original translates in just as a kind of key or a guidebook on the right to an actual data set. I believe there's a link to the work that they did, and you certainly can see this. This later will be published on our data through the journal, provided that it gets accepted through the peer review process. And what this did is create a data sheet of, I should build this down, I forgot, 32, I think it's 32 individuals with various transcribed and imputed attributes associated with them from the document that then became the basis for an exploration of these 32 individuals, these enslaved individuals, who they were, their enslavers or their hirers, and how to connect them to some other information that others had developed. Some of this related to work at the Legacies of Slavery in Maryland, a project that's Maryland State Archives, some things that have already been published on our data set as well. And I think Catherine will take it over from here to kind of like, how does this then become part of our data model?
Thanks, Daryle. Right. So Enslaved.org developed a data model to help structure this spreadsheets and data points on people in the historical slave trade. And it has four major components. The first element is people, as Daryle has described, and these would be enslaved people, but also enslavers, those who are participated in the slave trade. Then there's the second component is events. These are things that happened to these individuals. These could be a baptism, these could be a marriage, this could be a freedom event, an emancipation, or self-freeing event of running away. So the data model captures information about that. It also includes a slot for places, locations where these events took place. And then, of course, sources, which would make references to the original documents from which these other data components were derived. So not only does the Enslaved.org data model capture information about these four elements, it also records how these elements are connected to each other. So to unpack this a little bit, we have a simplified version of the data model here, where we have the four main entities of a person, event, a place, and a source. And it also has some information about how these are connected. So, for example, in the data model, we have a person has a role within an event, and then the event has participants. So the person is attached to the event, and the event is attached to a person. So a named person would then be identified as participating in their baptism, for example. And then there's an element that allows us to determine where an event took place. So event is attached to a place. And then each of these three, place, event, and person, we tie directly to its source document, so that each piece of information about an individual, about an experience, is very much connected and understood and tied to its historical source. And the arrows sort of display all of the various types of actions between the data in the data model. This organizational structure is sort of the foundation of Enslaved.org. So Enslaved.org also provides guidance about how to extract data from primary source materials by publishing important documents that we've been developing over the course of the project on our website. And these include documents that describe and explain our data model, which is what the ontology link is here, and then competency questions that helped us design and define what the data model would look like, what kind of questions were users going to be asking in order to, and questions that they would like to have answered by the data. We also provide links to the metadata fields that we use in these to sort of describe the four elements of a place, an event, a person, and a source, and then controlled vocabulary is used to provide some standardization within several of the fields within the data model. We also provide a sort of a lengthy and I think a useful document called Recommended Practices, which elaborates on how to transform, let's say, a will for example, that includes the names of enslaved women and men and children, and how you transform that sort of document into a spreadsheet of data that can be then analyzed in ways that can be challenging, when working only with a scanned facsimile of the document. So these resources are available on the enslaved.org site at docs.enslaved.org. And as Daryle mentioned, this project's been going on for quite some time, but in 2010, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and later Mellon, we worked with, sort of as a foundation, we collected and analyzed a dozen or more data sets from a variety of historians who are working in the domain of historical slavery studies. And we found that there's a core of fields that these scholars commonly extracted from documents, including names of people, their occupations, information about the relationships they had in their lives, information about life events that marked the arc of their life experiences, where they lived, where they worked, dates, and then of course, sources of these documents. And this research allowed us to specify and define very specific metadata fields for the project that are sort of at the foundation of enslaved.org. And this research and looking and analyzing the data sets that had been done previously allowed us to develop a data model that aligned with data that already existed. It wasn't, we were just making a data model for something that we had a vision for. We were really trying to build a data model on how historians were looking at and studying slavery. So you can learn more about this on the enslaved.org site at the docs page. Okay. So this is the enslaved.org recommended practices document, includes guidelines and suggestions for extracting data from historical documents, such as this one from the Library of Virginia. The title is drawn directly from the document itself. This is a list of slaves and free persons of color received in the Penitentiary of Virginia for sale and transportation from 25th June 1816 to 4th February 1842. And I'm using this example to draw some attention to some of the guidelines or guidance included in the enslaved.org recommended practices document. So the Library of Virginia partially transcribed the document and created a data set that includes the names and ages of enslaved people that were identified in the document and the names of those individuals who asserted ownership over these men and women and children. And the Library of Virginia made a conscious decision to focus on these 3 or 4 pieces of specific information. 1, the name of the enslaved person. 2, the age of the enslaved person. 3, the name of the enslaver. And then sort of the 4th piece is not exactly recorded in the data, but it's understood that it's coming from this source. But if we look back at the document, there are other valuable pieces of information that are not included in this data set. So for example, there are some very specific dates here. So we have date of receipt that was not recorded in the data that the Library of Virginia created. There's also information about places, so where sentenced, so that we would know that this person, Lewis, was sentenced in Washington, but that's something that is not included in the data set that the Library of Virginia created. And there's even some information here about relationships. We have here Matthew Sr. is listed, and then here below is Matthew Jr. So there's some relationship information that could be very valuable for those who are studying this period or this area to learn about these individuals that it's not represented in the data set that Library of Virginia created. So I'm not saying that these pieces of information have to be included in a data set submitted to enslaved.org. And in fact, like we acknowledge as a project, and we understand that historians and librarians and archivists approach data set creation with different goals in mind. So a historian might have a very specific research goal that he or she is trying to achieve. While librarians might have goals about providing better public access to collections for genealogists and family historians. So their focus is different and their needs are different. And we also acknowledge that there's a tension between sort of capturing absolutely every single piece of information that might be in a document and doing that only in a few small number of documents versus capturing information about enslaved individuals, maybe in a slightly more shallow way that's across a broader number of documents. And there's a tension there, and those are decisions that projects and contributors make. And the enslaved.org does not require contributors to follow one path. We really, in fact, try to make it as we try to include as much data from as much of the data that contributors provide for us as possible. But thinking about including these other pieces of information can raise questions, important questions about how to extract information to create a data set. So for example, as Daryle mentioned earlier, do you do a verbatim extraction? Do you try and reproduce the contents of this document in all its detail as closely as possible? And if you do that, what kinds of issues can come up? So what's at the bottom part of the slide here is what I'm calling a verbatim transcription of the document. And so when you look at that, there's pieces of information that would be lost if you don't have the whole. So for example, Lewis, which has here this date of receipt is December 1. If we do a verbatim transcription, we lose the full date. Another part that we also miss is under Matthew Jr., we lose information because of this shorthand DO, which is a ditto. And if you don't have the information about the line above it, then you've absolutely lost the content of the document and information about this individual. So and then it raises questions about what do you do about shorthand that are used in this document. And Daryle referenced this as well. What does this quotation mark mean? What does DO mean? Does it mean something else? And it takes some time for individuals to learn what this means. And then you have to make a decision of how I'm going to record this information as a contributor. So instead of doing a verbatim transcription, you could do an interpretation or a standardization of the data. And this slide gives a demonstration of what that would look like. So on this slide, you can see an example of both interpretation and some standardization. So the full date has been included for these for the shortened dates that use DO, and they've been written completely out. And then anywhere that there's DO, the word is written out. And then the standardization is that we've chosen this particular example is showing that a standard version of date, which is year, month, day is used, and then it's used consistently so that it can make it easier for this data to be understood. And then finally, if you wanted to do something with family relationships, you could in fact add another column to this data set that would include something about the fact that Matthew Sr. and Matthew Jr. are likely related people, father and son. So these are the types of topics that we try and tackle in the enslaved.org recommended practices document. There's other information as well, but this is sort of an example of some of the types of things that we've tried to cover in it. So if there's data sets that individuals are starting to develop now, it would be a good place to start taking a look at the recommended practices document. So how can contributors submit to enslaved.org? Well, they do it through the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, and the submission to the journal includes the data set, which is a spreadsheet, as Daryle mentioned, a data dictionary, which is really the materials that Daryle was showing on the screen previously, which is the name, which you've seen previously, and then a data article. These materials go through a formal review process, and that includes options for different types of reviews, which I will go into on the next slide or two. And at the end of the process, there are 3 products that are created or available. There's the published data article, an archived data set, and then a linked data representation of the data integrated into enslaved.org. So what is the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation? It's a digital academic journal that publishes data articles describing original data sets on the lives of enslaved Africans and their descendants from the 15th century to the early 20th century. And it is the intake mechanism for enslaved.org. It's where we have panels of reviewers who are experts in the area to verify that the content is both within scope and meets the measure of seriousness for coming into the project. And it's a peer review journal, and the journal also serves as an access point for getting to the data sets themselves through links to the data repository and through the data on the linked open data representation of it on enslaved.org. So the goals of the journal are to elevate the publication of data sets and the accompanying data articles to the level of a standard journal articles. And it's also, and I think this is pretty critically important, is to ensure the availability of the data sets for current users and for future use. And we do that in a couple of ways, which I'll explain shortly. So this is a screenshot of one of the 7 data articles in the most recent issue of the journal. It's African Baptisms in Havana, Cuba from 1590 to 1600. And it describes a data set it describes a data set that includes over 1,000 Africans and people of African origin depicted in Havana's earliest baptismal records, which currently stays in the archive. Well, no, it's not in the archive, but it's in the church in Havana, Cathedral San Cristobal's in Havana. But the materials have also been scanned into the in a digital format into the Slave Society's digital archive at Vanderbilt University, where they're viewable online. Each baptismal entry in this data set includes the name of the person being baptized, the date of the baptism, name of the priest or the sacristan administering the baptism, and names of baptized persons. If they have parents and godparents, they're also named, and a relationship is brought out by naming them. So the reason I'm sort of pausing on this is that this is an example of a data article on in the journal, and the data article is intended to sort of describe the methods used to create the data set. It includes things such as the names of the archives and the collections that the contributor consulted, used for their data set. It also includes information about the data extraction processes. Was the data extracted verbatim? Was there standardization? Did they use controlled vocabularies of their own? How did they handle information about in multiple different languages? If it was, and explanations also about its sort of historical significance. So to learn more about what the specific parts of the data article are, you can go to the contribute page of the journal. And on that page, there is an annotated sample of a data article sort of explaining the various pieces. And there's also a template for completing a data article that prompts the contributor to provide the required contextual information. So the submission, the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation submission process includes these main steps. First, a contributor submits material to the journal, and these are the 3 pieces that they contribute. They contribute a data set, which is the structured information from the historical document. basically a spreadsheet. And then they contribute as well the field names, a data dictionary, which should include the field names and definitions and information about controlled vocabularies used to standardize the data. And then the third part of the submission is a data article that describes sources and methodology and the historical significance of the data. And so the data dictionary and the data article should provide enough contextualization so that the data set can be discovered, understood, and used by others, including for long-term secondary purposes that were not envisioned at the time that the data set was created. And so that's where I'm the librarian in the group. That's where I've been really sort of insistent on pushing for very clear definitions for fields and field names, but then also definitions. So often we've seen data set creators who they know what the data means and they know what the field heading means, but it's not necessarily clear to a second or third party who is reading it. So the data dictionary is meant to really give concrete, clear guidance so that there's little confusion about what the data in a particular column is meant to describe. The dataset contributor also selects a review option, and there are 2 review options that can accommodate different needs that contributors have with different publishing goals and requirements. So the peer review is similar to standard journal review, providing rigorous peer review of the data article and the data set. So both of them. And it's overseen by the managing editor and the editorial board, and working in conjunction with invited experts, expert reviewers who are typically experts within the period and the geographic scope of the data set. And then there's an in-house review submission process, editorial review submission process, where contributors who want to share their data on enslaved.org, and these are reviewed by the journal's editor and editorial team and accepted or rejected based on the quality of the documentation and relevance to the journal. Let's see what time we have here. Okay, I'm going to try and just zip through the rest of this. So the submission and peer review processes are handled through the open journal system. Enslaved.org established a relationship with the MSU Press in order to leverage their journal management system, which the Journal of OJS is their system, and it's an open software. It's an open software application for managing the publication of scholarly journals. And this collaboration with the press was huge for the project and for the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, because we had, prior to using OJS, we had been managing all submission, review, and publication activities in a series of different applications, including GitLab and Google Forms and Google Mail, and then local email accounts. And this just was not going to work for the long term of the project. So these systems worked, but they were clunky and time consuming. So for managing these materials, so OJS has streamlined the submission and review processes in really important ways. And we're grateful to the MSU Press for working with us to allow us to use it. So even though we use OJS to manage our submission and review processes, we manage the publication process in a different system. So we publish the journal on our website via CORA, which is an open source digital repository application that was developed at the research center where I work at, Digital Humanities Center. And then we use a relationship with the MSU libraries to leverage the library's DOI minting platform. So we mint DOIs for the data articles using DataCite. We do data remediation and data integration into enslaved.org using OpenRefine and wiki-based tooling, so that we can, wiki-based tooling for integration into our graph database. And we use those for data cleaning, data normalization, and then the integration process. And then as data articles are published on the journals, on the journal, the data is prepared for publication as linked data on enslaved.org and is prepared for deposit on Dataverse. So JSDP deposits the data set and other descriptive metadata with Dataverse, a general purpose data repository operated by Harvard University, where the data set is assigned a DOI and is preserved and made searchable alongside data produced and shared by researchers from many other disciplines. And the journal prepares and uploads all of the materials into Dataverse for the journal. Here's an example of one data set that's on Dataverse. This is the same example that we looked at previously. You can see here that there's a DOI available here. This is a DOI for the data set, not the data article. And you can also see here that there's some data metrics about how many downloads. This is a new publication, so there's only one download, but this would allow a contributor to see how often their data was being used. This is the raw data that would be submitted to the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, and that went through the review process. Users can also see additional metadata about the data set. They can learn about terms of use and versioning. So if the data set has been transformed over time, updated versions are available on Dataverse. Old versions remain, but then the updated version is also available. And importantly, users can download the data for their own purposes. So the Dataverse metadata is open and findable via search engines. And this sort of increases the visibility of the data and serves as another access point to the data, with pointers back to sort of the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. And so we looked to Dataverse to help us. I think I've got about I just have one more slide. So we looked to Dataverse to help us meet our data stewardship obligations to ensure the availability of the data sets for current and future users. Harvard hosts Dataverse repository using Amazon Web Services, and they also have a backup that they do with the Faculty of Arts and Sciences Research Computing. They maintain a backup of the Dataverse data and directories. And so these multiple copies of the JSDP datasets provide redundancy for the data that the journal itself backs up in CORA. So this dual approach results in multiple copies of the dataset at Harvard and at MSU under completely different administrative and technical infrastructures and reduces the likelihood of data loss. So that's the end of the submission process and publication process, and sort of brings us pretty close here to the end of the presentation. So, I think we hit on the topics we set out to talk about, provided an overview of enslaved.org, talked about the data model, provided some guidance on resources you can use to guide historical slavery data set creation, and an explanation about how to contribute to enslaved.org through the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. So maybe we can take some questions.
Good deal. And for those who joined late, if you would submit your questions via the chat column, we'll take them in the order in which they are lodged in the column. We have one to start off with here. Catherine and Daryle, can you provide some examples of how Enslaved.org tries to address or confront biases included in original documents that can be reproduced in data extracted from these materials?
Sure. I don't know why my hand's up. Yeah, I'll start on this one. So one of the things is we have the requirement that our contributors are explicit about what they've done with the original source materials. Is it a transcription? Is it exact transcription? So that's a choice made, but that certainly would reflect that the data set reflects whatever the biases of the original material are. If they've taken that and they've done any sort of standardization, normalization, adaptations, that would also be a way in which we talk about biases in the original documentation and then how they are reflected or manipulated or changed or interpreted by the contributor. And then our controlled vocabulary is also another way that you see how at the project level, we use the word enslaver and enslaved for our controlled vocabulary, even if that's not what appeared in the original documentation. So that is I mean, one could say it's a new set of biases or it's arguments that we're making at our level in our control vocabulary. So at each stage, it's being explicit, recognizing that original source materials are exceptionally of their time and period, and they can be biased in all kinds of different ways and very harmful. You know, the documentation, original documentation itself it was an instrument of harm and dehumanization and violence, as well as reflecting a larger processes of harm and dehumanization. And then what we do as researchers, and then as also those of us who are publishing this material to intervene in that material and being explicit about it, and then making that part of the peer review process. So we have some expertise weighing in on the choices made and how effective those choices are.
Okay. John asked a question a bit ago, and Daryle, you answered it wonderfully and completely in the chat column. Could you show how the data connects back to the primary sources at the partner institution?
Right, and I think Catherine maybe just seeing this just now. So I showed a couple of examples of how we do this in our kind of when we put the information out on social media. When we say something's been published, we tag the original archive if it is taggable. So that gets that there. In the actual publication, the sources, the acknowledgement, and the methodology sections each ask of the contributor to talk about their sources. And then in individual records, they will point back to where that comes from, as Catherine talked about in our data model, the person, event, place, and source. And they'll point back to that piece of the original contribution, which must include some reference to a source.
Yeah. And I can jump in just to elaborate a little bit more. If the contributor includes a column in their data set that has a very specific link to their source, let's say at the Slave Society digital archive that I referenced for the Cuban baptisms, if there is a specific, which this one does have, there's a specific link to a very specific document page. If that's included in the data set, it will both remain in the spreadsheet so that there's a line saying this record comes from this document over here, not just a source citation, but also a link to it. That will remain with the data in Dataverse. And then when it's there, we integrate it into the linked open data at enslaved.org. So if somebody wants to see that document, they can get straight to it. That was also the case with the Library of Virginia, just finished making some changes to their backend repositories, so they were able to give us a very clear link to their content, so that has just been recently published on enslaved.org. You can see a representation of that as well there. So there's concretely, it's if it's included in the data set in the spreadsheet, we can include it both. We can include it on enslaved.org itself, and then it can also be referenced in, as Daryle mentioned, the data article, and also it can be included in the data article and in the data that's deposited at Harvard's Dataverse.
Okay. John Dugan asked, is journal submission required to participate?
So maybe I'll let Daryle do some of this, but I'm gonna do a first take at it. It is required in the sense because we want to have it is a mechanism for us to do a couple of things. It's not meant as a barrier. It's really meant as a way to explain the data and the data set in a more full, complete way. It also gives us an opportunity to sort of take a look at the materials to see if they're in scope, and then to make sure that if we have questions about how the data could be described in a sort of a richer fashion that would meet a broader audience, we can give some input on that front as well. But it is, yes, it is required. It's just part of the process by which we look, analyze, and make sure that the data is appropriate. And then, but I would argue that it's an important component, but it's not a huge, heavy lift. So I don't know if Daryle, you want to elaborate on that in any way.
I think a different way of talking about it is what the nature of the goals of participation are. Because we're open source, open access, the materials are available to anyone at any time to use, peruse, share. You can download the data sets, manipulate them, for the ways that are of interest to you, the questions you might want to ask. We have things called stories, which are narratives, biographical narratives mainly. Those certainly can be used in a whole variety of things. So in that way, participation, engagement with the materials is, we try to make the barriers to access as low as possible. But Catherine is also correct that to contribute new materials, the portal or the pathway to do that is principally through our journal. We do have some contributions coming in on the story side, the biography side, and that's kind of a particular thing there. But if someone's interested in contributing a narrative biography, then we can put you in contact with one of our team members who's responsible for that particular piece. And then we have these various kinds of scholarly student training programs. I mentioned one we had this past summer with 700 graduates. We'll be rolling out something next summer for graduates, students, and also for scholars. And so their participation in this kind of larger community of scholarship that we also open those spaces.
Okay, and there's one last question before we segue to Lisa Johnson and our all-important closing material. But this question, is the focus limited to domestic enslavement in the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade, or is the intent to broaden the scope to earlier enslavement and enslavement in other geographic locales? And you've addressed this somewhat in chat, but for those of us who aren't reading the chat.
Yeah, we both struggle, but also I would say we're comfortable where we've landed here. Our core is Atlantic slavery. So that's a pretty broad sweep. Late 15th through late 19th century across enormous space and time. And slave societies with slaves, north, south, east, west, both coastal and interior societies. So that is what we've looked at, but we do have some conversations both to come to a direct connection. Certainly the transatlantic slave trade to Brazil, for instance, includes Mozambique. So we're in the Indian Ocean right there. But also about how we think about forms of enslaved, of unfree labor and freedom in Atlantic, in Indian and in Pacific Ocean societies, also across time, ancient slavery, among others. So we are in dialogue, but our particular scope, and I think Catherine just touched on this, if you make a new contribution. If we had something about slavery in ancient Rome, for instance, that would be out of scope. And we would say, fantastic work, but I think we need to find a place for you that would be appropriate for that.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much. I've learned a lot today. I'm sure other listeners have too. I much appreciate this. And Lisa, do you want to take over and do the closing information?
Thank you, David.
Thank
you so much to both of our presenters today for a very informative session. And one last comment from John Dugan. He said, I see huge value in publishing the content, but I think there will be some hang up for some state archives. So perhaps we need to formulate a discussion through CoSA directly with enslaved.org on how we might facilitate that from state archives. Publishing is not always something that they do. So that's just an aside for future conversations. So as we close out, I just want to remind you, we have upcoming member webinars. October is our State Archives Showcase, and we're going to learn about New York and New Jersey. And then in November, we have an in conversation with Hilda from the Puerto Rican thing. Now, this was recorded a couple of months ago, so it doesn't reflect her current problems now with no electricity, etc. So Catherine, next. And then, of course, the CERI webinar, they will have one for the October Electronic Records Day. So go to the website and you can register for that next. And of course, we have our shop talks with our vendors, and we hope you'll all join us for those. Here's the dates. And then again, go to the website to register for those. And as always, you can reach out to us in a variety of means. Here's all our different information. And with that, of course, none of our work at CoSA would be possible without all of the contributions of our sponsors and funders. And so we appreciate all of that. And as we close out, there will be a brief evaluation. We hope you will take time to fill that out. That really does help the Education Committee as they process and prepare for future programs for you. So thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you for all our attendees. Thank you for all of our presenters. And David, thank you for your moderation today. And with that, we'll close out and we'll see you all at the next CoSA member webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.